Hello everyone, Timothée Parrique. I'm a researcher at the University of Lund in Sweden, so that explains why I'm not here physically with you today, even though I would love it. It's a bit far for someone that doesn't fly. So you can have this recorded version of me instead, and I hope you guys will have a fantastic discussion after this. I was asked to freely share a few thoughts about the history of degrowth as a concept and as a movement. And so you guys, I guess, know that degrowth comes from the French concept of décroissance, which emerged in 2002. Now, there's a bit of a paradox, because if the concept of décroissance emerged in France, it is not in France that it is today the most popular. Or at least in 2019, there were a grand meeting of all the groups that were left in France on the concept of degrowth, and the final outcome of that meeting was the acknowledgement that the degrowth movement in France has collapsed. No one was interested in degrowth anymore. So that was in 2019. Of course, there's been the pandemic and things have changed a bit since then. But what's still interesting is that there's been just this rise in popularity and then poof, disappeared. I think we need to reflect very hard on why this happens. I don't have an answer for you. That's a research question. What I can share is that in writing a history of these years, which you can find in the chapter 5 of my thesis, The Political Economy of Degrowth, I've discovered that there was a lot of useless feuds. And so perhaps that's my first point. I think very counterproductively, there's been a lot of energy being spent between sub-factions of the same, more or less, paradigm. I mean, the best example is the battle between degrowth and eco-socialism, which has been raging since the emergence of the two terms. I mean, they're roughly the same age. Eco-socialism as a term also starts to pick up speed in early 2000s, just like degrowth. And for roughly a decade, it was just like eco-socialists criticizing degrowthers and degrowthers criticizing eco-socialists back. Even though I think, when you look the two paradigms, you realize, well, you guys, there are more common points than differences. Actually, this year, 2023, there's been a few publications, Kohei Saito's work on degrowth communism. There's been this article published on an eco-socialist degrowth, so kind of convergence of the two paradigms. So I think it seems like after 10 years of useless battles, people are like, well, it's kind of the same thing. Same thing in France, kind of big fight between collapsologists and degrowthers. Two sub-factions of, you could say, like ecologist in the broader understanding, political ecologist in the broader understanding of the term. So again, there's been a lot of wasted time in this kind of conceptual beauty contest of who's got the best concept, who's the, this ultimate battle for truth, which is a bit silly because, this is not a game of chess. There's just, we can compromise, we can acknowledge the fact that we have a large toolbox of concept, but we should have spent more time in alliance building and less time in kind of purity concept. Something that has changed radically since the early 2000s is that there's been the emergence of the science of degrowth. So now you have over 600 articles, perhaps even more, in English published since 2007. Roughly now every year you get like 100 academic articles being published on the topic of degrowth, concerning degrowth and energy, degrowth and transport, the law and degrowth, the economics of degrowth, whatever. Many scholars, many master theses, PhD theses, people that are becoming specialists. So you have more and more courses, summer schools, all of that. And so all arguments that have been lying around since the 1970s, if you read, Cornelius Castoriadis, André Gortz, Ivan Illich, Françoise de Bonne, like many of Murray Bookchin, of the thinkers of that time. I mean, these ideas have been further consolidated, further explored, empiricized, put into comparison, better theorized. So now there's a variety of stronger arguments that you can find in that scientific literature. This has, of course, been given some credibility to the concept. I think it's important to build on that credibility. The idea has been changing. At first, it was just a hunch, a gut feeling, like infinite growth on a final planet. What could go wrong? Now, this is not a hunch anymore. This is like hundreds of studies that have been demonstrating theoretically, empirically, the infeasibility of that infinite growth. And then many more studies that have been exploring socially, culturally, politically, ecological limits of the growth paradigm and capitalism as a whole. So it's important in the way we debate to not always fall back in square one and be like, oh yeah, but what about this? And George Rogan was wrong about his application of entropy to matter. Like that, this is science. There's a step, building of knowledge. That knowledge is not perfect. It's learning through falsification, but there's been a lot of movement. And so every time we get to debate, we cannot have the very same discussions we had in early 2000s, and we cannot have the very same discussion we had in the 1970s. So I know, of course, that not everyone is reading academic literature, but I think that's our responsibility as scholars and activists to just use that knowledge to enrich the discussion. It's not using that knowledge to be right. It's just using that knowledge to make sure we have the right kind of discussions, the discussions that help us to solve problems and in the real world. So I think that's at least one of the responsibility I see for scientists and these kind of meetings, to have more interesting discussions than we had back then. This is why I always get this kind of like spider sense, like tingling, when we're having a discussion and people are like, oh yeah, but technology will save us, or growth is not compatible with human nature. I'm like, been there before, like Groundhog Day feeling, like been there before 10 years ago. People have been there before 20 years ago. Herman Daly has been there before when he was defending the steady state, 30, 40 years ago. And so therefore these discussions, they are not interesting anymore. I mean, they're interesting in philosophical discussions, for seminars and, intellectual inquiries, for fun. But politically right now, we're thinking about avoiding, mass ecological breakdown. These are not the discussions we should be having. We should be having much more precise discussions built on things we've discovered, about what we know and about what we don't know about the planetary crisis. There's also been 2 European conferences, so that makes it a bit special, degrowth in the European continent. There was the Post-Growth Conference in September 2018 and the Beyond Growth Conference in May 2023, so I attended both of them. The first one was still a PhD student. I came and presented. The second one as a researcher for Lund University, and you can really see the difference. 2018, low-key conference, no media was there, no media report, very small attendance and very specialized attendance. So it was just mostly growth skeptical, growth critical people, degrowth, post-growth scholars that were here and attended the conference. So it felt like a university conference. The second one was bigger, like several thousand people attended. And so the crowd was much more diverse. It was also longer. There were just more presentation. There was just a bigger event, and the media were there. There's been a bit of a disappointing coverage afterwards, I felt. But during the event, there's been a few reports. There's been TV. There's been then a few articles, op-eds about it. So, I mean, it would be a bit of a simplification to say the first one was a failure, the second one was a success. But I definitely had that feeling. At the first one, it was just too crowded that could not communicate. So the growth critical scholars that came with their best concept, talking about post-extractivism and anti-capitalism and commoning and complementary currency and dépense and universal basic services. And you had European bureaucrats that were just, how do we pay for this? How do we measure that? And the two could not really understand each other because they were not at the same level. I'll always find this when I go to an event and you come with the mind of like a quantum physicist. Like you think very theoretical about like the essence of well-being and what is an economy is for. And on the other side, get someone with a very practical problem. So if you want to fix your bike tire, you don't go to a quantum physicist asking for the very nature of what an atom is. You don't care. You go to a mechanic, like, what tool do I need to fix this? So European bureaucrats were asking for concrete solutions to concrete problems, and degrowthers, scholars and activists were more like giving them an overall systemic overview of how the system works, which is nice, but a bit useless if you're policymakers. 2023 was different. There was a variety of contributions, some of them theoretical, some of them very policy-oriented. And so I think what I take from this event was the wealth of things that had been presented. And I think many policymakers realizing that, wow, that paradigm is not just intellectual entertainment. It has actually policy implication. And in a warming world, in a world of secular stagnation, in a world with many social ecological uncertainties, well, we might want to have this in our belt. Crafting an imaginary of our own. And that's perhaps my last point of now, like, the ideas are there, the science is there, it's strong, the numbers are here, the models are available. Maybe it's time to just translate this into more expressive visions, using novels, using cinema. I mean, I remember the book from Samuel Alexander, Entropia, from 2013, which I find is great. There's a few of these novels that have been published in France in the last few years, kind of utopian novels exploring post-capitalist imaginaries. So I think perhaps now there's efforts that must be made to just educate our collective desires for these futures that we thought were impossible, but we thought were impossible for the wrong reasons. Wrong reasons because we were kind of prisoners of an hegemonic visions of the economy that is actually not valid. And if you take different economic assumptions, then all of a sudden, that beautiful future you could be having becomes possible. I think that's it for my time. So I'm wishing you a beautiful conference, and I hope I'll get to meet you guys another time in reality.